I'm Don Wallace. Professors always want quiet in the classroom, so I want to welcome you to the International Law Institute. You'll be hearing from Yonah Alexander and General Gray of the Potomac Institute, who are really the forces behind this. Our topic, post-attempted coup in Turkey, Quo Vadis. I have a personal interest in Turkey because I served as the regional legal advisor for aid in the Middle East, living in Ankara many years ago, and I wrote a book called Introduction to Turkish Law, which is now in its 6th edition, which is a good sign. I think at this point I'm not going to say much. I think we all know how important Turkey is, and I think everyone, Turks and non-Turks, know how significant the various forces are internally and externally now working on Turkey. As an American...
Wallace, can you be louder?
I'm sorry?
Can you turn it up a little bit?
Louder.
That's another thing professors hate, when students say talk louder. But you're not students, so I suppose I shouldn't hate you. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
I think if you come up here, you'll have to all do the same thing. Just figure out which of these mics doesn't work. Anyway, I think we all know how important Turkey is, particularly important to the United States. Turkey is, as we know, a member of NATO. It's a central power in dealing with troubles in its neighborhood. And let's see how it all plays out today. So, Yonah, you're in charge. And be sure to speak up so you don't get criticized.
I don't have to sing, so that's good. Thank you. Don, can you hear me in the back? Okay, great. Let me first welcome all of you to our special seminar on Turkey. And obviously, first and foremost, I would like to welcome our panelists and the speakers. So let me first introduce them in that order. Fortunately, we do have the bios of the speakers in the package that you received, so I will not go into great details, identify them specifically. To my right is Dr. Ahmed Yalla, who is the Deputy Director of the International Center for the Study of Violent Extremism, and formerly he was a professor and chair of Sociology Department at Havana University in Turkey. And also I may note that on his rich background, he was a former chief of counterterrorism and operations division for the Turkish National Police, with some 20 years of service. Next to him is Dr. Sinan Sidi, who is a visiting assistant professor and director of the Institute for Turkish Studies, School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Again, he has a very extensive experience, particularly in the academic, having educated in the UK, published extensively in the field. Next to him is Dr. Kamil Kürçi, who is now the director of the Center of the United States and Europe-Turkey Project at the Brookings Institution. He is also a very distinguished academic, worked for many years in Turkey, and you can see a long list of his very important field, and particularly he would also deal with the European Union, Turkish relations, refugees, etc. Next to him is Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, who is Vice President of Research of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. Again, if you look at his brief resume, you will see that he had experience also in the U.S. Government, in the Department of Treasury, and some of the think tanks in town, and he published extensively in the field. Now, I would like to mention that this particular event, as many others that we organize, we have co-sponsors in addition to the International Law Institute, and of course we do have the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, and the Center, the International Center for Terrorism Studies. We are honored always to have with us General Al Gray, who is going to make some closing remarks. And as you know, is the 29th Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, and currently a senior fellow and chairman of the Board of Regents of the Potomac Institute. So we certainly welcome our speakers, but I like to welcome also the audience, and I recognize in the audience many academics and government officials and diplomats who have very distinguished, I think, experience in the area that we're going to discuss. And what we're going to do is to give the speakers, the panelists, an opportunity to speak for about 10 minutes, to be followed by Q&A. And certainly we welcome the input of the audience and so on. Now, in addition to that, I, just for 1 second, will try to use the very sophisticated technology, if it works. Okay. I do hope that you can see in the back, particularly, I think it is important to see the broader perspective. What we are trying to achieve in a very short period of time is to deal with some of the historical context of the Turkish Republic, the lessons for the present and the future, the attempted coup cost implications, and then the security challenges related to terrorism, such as the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State, the PKK, Iraq, Syria, and so on, the refugee crisis, internal politics, the civilian-military relations, the government structure, the rule of law, economic development, and so on. And finally, the external relations, which really covers the entire world, dealing all the way from UN to the EU to US, the Arab and the Muslim world, Israel, Cyprus, you name it. And I think that it depends on the interest also of the audience. Now, may I make 2 additional footnotes, and then we'll call the panelists to make the presentations. I'm trying always to look at the forest as well as the trees. And although we are focusing today specifically on Turkey, obviously you cannot deal with Turkey with the challenges, the opportunities, without looking at the broader picture. By that I mean the entire world, particularly the West and the United States. I always try to look at the so-called historical lessons. For example, what happened during the month of August, this month, that would command our attention. Thank you. We have really specialists here who know what to do. So some 20 years ago in August 1996, you can see that Osama bin Laden issued a very important declaration of war against the West and against the United States, and indeed against the entire world. And particularly, Osama bin Laden called for the attacks on Americans. I'm mentioning this because obviously this is an issue of national security in the United States and also abroad. So this is the broader, really, picture in terms of the challenges. So obviously Turkey is one challenge that is a partner in the battle against terrorism in general. And the second one, which I remember very vividly, goes back over 40 years ago, back to 1979 in August, when the Turkish ambassador in Paris and his driver were assassinated by Asala, the Secret Army for the Liberation of Armenia. I'm mentioning this because everybody is focusing, obviously, today about the so-called coup and the implications, but one has to look at the historical context as well in order to appreciate what's happening. Now, obviously, we do have the panel, and you can recognize that three of the speakers are Turks with that kind of background, but I want to make sure that the discussion, the presentation of the panelists, the discussion with the audience, obviously does represent the views of the personal views of the individuals, and they do not represent necessarily the views of the co-sponsors and discussion. We recognize the interest, and I would like to mention one more thing academically, that some of us worked on these issues for a very long time. Why Turkey? And I like to mention, obviously, the work that goes back to the 60s in terms of our studies and work on Turkey, in Turkey, with Turkish universities in the US, around the world, interested in Turkey. Also academic journals that we published on Turkey. And particularly, I'd like to mention a publication which we developed in Ankara with the NATO-based general staff of Turkey at the time, Partnership for Peace. And obviously, there were many other publications that we dealt with. This is the publication that we developed at the time in order to develop a coalition around the world to deal with security concerns. And finally, also we try to focus on particularly the challenges such as the bin Laden, the Al-Qaeda, translated in many languages, including Turkish, and also special publications, which, by the way, we published here in cooperation with the International Law Institute on Turkey and Turkish interest to join the European Union. So with that, I'd like to mention that today's seminar is another one in the many seminars that we conducted in Turkey and around the world on many of the issues, with the exception, of course, on the coup that just took place. And we always try to strike a balance between the security considerations and the human rights issues. And therefore, in that spirit, I think we can conduct the discussion today. So I would invite our panelists to make their presentation. Initially, 10 minutes, and then you will have more time.
Sure.
Okay? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Ahmet Said Yayla, currently Deputy Director of International Center on the Study of Violent Extremism, former Chief of Police Counter-Terrorism Department in Turkey. I would like to start very briefly and conclude my comments because we have only 10 minutes. First of all, I would like to start with condemning any coup attempt or any coup, any intervention to any democracy. I think this is so critical that we understand and draw our stand, our point. However, I am also for democracy and the rule of law. It is also essential that we keep acting under the rule of law and we are respectful to the human rights and to the freedom of speech. So first I would like to start with the coup attempt itself. This coup attempt started at 10 p.m. while everybody was up. So this was a big question as soon as it started for me. Why, as it happened in the past, it didn't start at 3 a.m. in the morning, everybody was sleeping. Fast forward to today, we have almost 3 weeks, over 15 days. Over half of the generals in the military are arrested, around 165. We have, I guess, around 350 generals in Turkish military. We still do not know who were behind the coup in terms of the names of the generals and the people who conducted the coup. So this is another big question for me. Also, everybody knows in this world today that if you are going to make an attempt to a coup, you need to cut the communication on the internet. And this wasn't done during this coup attempt. They only confiscated Turkish radio and television, which almost nobody watches in Turkey. All the channels were free to broadcast without any problems. Nobody from the government was arrested, including the Prime Minister and several ministers. They were up in the public talking about the coup attempt. And very abruptly, the parliament was bombed. And still we don't know who bombed which pilot, who was the pilot behind that bombing. And there were rumors that other places were going to be bombed. Some parts of the palace was also bombed. So when I look at it from a distance, I really don't understand what kind of coup it was. Obviously, the coup attempters knew that if they were not successful, they were doomed. They were going to be arrested. There were going to be a lot of problems for them. But this coup was carried out in a way that they wanted to fail. So what was it? Was it a God-sent gift for a struggling government to establish a so-wanted new Turkish Republic through a revolution? I don't know. I'm going to look at it with the evidence I have, because we Turks really like to rumor or conspiracy theories, and I don't want to talk about them, but I would like to put on the table what I have. Once I had a great teacher, an intelligence teacher, when I was at the police academy. He used to tell us, if you would like to see who is behind an attack, you should look at who benefits from it. Now, I worked in anti-terrorism, counter-terrorism, and operations division for 20 years in Turkey. In Ankara, at the capital, and in Şanlıurfa, which is a border city to Syria, with over 2.5 million people now with refugees. I know the capacity of the police, the counter-terrorism divisions, especially in Ankara and Istanbul. Just 3 hours after Erdogan's private jet landed at the Atatürk airport. 1,563 military officers were arrested, or they started to arrest those officers around Turkey. Some of them were directly involved in the coup attempt, some of them were not, some of them were on vacation, and some of them were even openly against the coup. From technical standpoint of view, in 3 hours, as a chief of police, I cannot make a list of 1,500 people, find out their addresses, where they live, and then get the paperwork ready, distribute it to all over Turkey, and start to arrest them. So this is the biggest question I have. And when I look at the afterwards, today the number is 90,000. There are almost 20,000 people arrested. Over 90,000 people purged. It obviously tells me that the lists were prepared way before the coup attempt. Most probably at least 6 months or a year, because it is impossible to figure out who is who or who was behind a coup in that fast. And if you look at the people who were purged, they were deans, professors, doctors, journalists. Most probably didn't have any connection and nothing to do with the coup. We go from there to what happened afterwards. As soon as the coup attempt happened, the blames started to come out. The first blame was to a Muslim cleric living here in the United States. And he was domestically claimed to be behind the coup. And then the second was the Americans. We started to see in the media that first a general was behind the coup, and then the CIA was behind the coup, provided $2 billion for the coup. Then Obama name came up. Then we had the demonstrations, mass demonstrations, and it has never stopped. Today, to this day, we still have those demonstrations. Yesterday alone, or 2 days ago, there was still demonstrations around Incirlik base. And in fact, 2 days ago, Incirlik base gates and the roads, highways to Incirlik base were blocked by the municipality trucks, claiming that there was going to be another coup coming from the Incirlik base. When we look at the rhetoric and what's happening after the aftermath of the coup, with mass demonstrations, harsh criticizing of the West, finger pointing to the Americans, blaming the Americans, the hatred pumped into the society, we can clearly see that we are going towards an endpoint that we had seen in the past carried out by Stalin, Hitler, and Khomeini. First, created an enemy, domestic and international, then blamed everything on those enemies, then steered masses for demonstrations, public demonstrations against those enemies with the messages of hatredness, taking up that level to another level by carrying out violent activities, which we had seen by burning American flags in front of the Incirlik base. And most probably we are going to see more. And I truly believe that the last point is going to be a specific desired Turkish revolution. And I think it is going to be a political Islamist and Salafist Turkish revolution. For that, I'm going to explain why. Just after the coup, according to the Sabah newspaper, Saudis came out and said that they are pledging $550 billion to invest in Turkey for the next 5 years. Turkey's yearly GPO is $200 billion. It was a little bit strange because Saudis also are struggling with their economy. The oil prices are really low. But more strange was how ISIS members were cheering up at the Telegram channels where we are watching the International Center to Study on Violence and Extremism. And ISIS members were so happy that the military coup attempt was unsuccessful. Why? Because they knew that if the military came, they wouldn't be free to operate in Turkey, and they would stop operating in Turkey. They had to leave in Turkey. Their bases, their operations, and logistical support they are receiving from Turkey would stop. The Incirlik base was closed for 2 days. The ISIS members also mentioned and talked about the fact that they killed over 500 coalition forces soldiers, FSO soldiers, because there were no coalition air flight support on the ground. And they pledged and swore at the Telegram accounts that may Allah allow us 1 month without air support to our enemy, we will kill them all. And as far as I know, the ISIS fighters, I can guarantee you that they are going to kill them all if there is no air support. So where are we going with this purges, arrests, hatred pumped into the society, a big divided society, anti-West, anti-American sentiment? I guess very soon, with the change of the Turkish constitution, we are going to have a new Turkish Republic with the new constitution. And I truly think that it's going to be a political Islamist and close to Salafist ideology. And we can also see that the coup members by several members of the government were announced as infidels, which is Tekfiri ideology. As Prophet Muhammad said, if a Muslim is labeling someone as an infidel, if that person is not an infidel, himself is an infidel. We see labeling, this kind of labeling, Tekfiri labeling, with Al-Qaeda and ISIS mostly. Their whole ideology is based on Tekfirism. And also, strange enough, Turkish religious authority banned the religious services to those people. But the ISIS Istanbul bomber who carried out the suicide attack was serviced in his funeral by the Turkish religious authority. So I am truly concerned about where our understanding of Islam is going and where my country is approaching. I would like to tell a story and then finish up. 2 days ago, someone I know from the police who was the chief of organized crime division in a small city in Turkey, and he was arrested after 17 December 2013 operations, corruption charges brought against Erdogan's ministers and his son, and he was running away because he didn't want to get arrested. 2 days ago, his wife was arrested because he didn't show up, he was running away, and they had a baby under 1 year old who was being breastfed by his mom. That baby was not allowed to be taken by his mom, and he was left with his high school and middle school brothers and sisters. And today, while I was coming here, I read an 87-year-old lady was arrested because his lawyer's son was not found, or they couldn't find him. Instead, they arrested his mom. And with the Saudi approach, I would like to tell you this. Kureli Military School, Turkey's oldest school, over 200 years old, was established 200 years ago, was closed 2 days ago by any act passed with the power of the government has right now through the legislation. Today, there was news on the media that Turkey's most precious and most expensive real estate, which is Kuleli Military School at the Bosphorus, was being sold or is being sold to the Saudis. So, thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me, Professor Alexander and Professor Don Wallace. It's a great pleasure to be here. Wow, what to achieve in 10 minutes? I mean, I've been thinking about this for the last few days with all of my colleagues here on the panel, as well as Turkey-focused scholars and policymakers in Washington, Europe, Turkey. And in trying to make sense of this, I think we're not going to get anywhere fast over the next 40 minutes or 50 minutes. I think this is a great wake-up call for political scientists who were always told, when I was being raised as a graduate student, that civil-military relations was an area that was dead. Nobody studies it anymore. So maybe after Egypt, Turkey, Thailand, I think civil-military relations might be back on again. Who knows? The business of coup making, is it in the budding? I don't know. So to start off from the premise of what actually happened and why it actually happened, I think we're still in the stages of just getting some very preliminary information. Of all the colleagues that I've spoken to, of all the sort of news information that I have been able to assimilate, there are divergent views. I think there is a mainstream view in Turkey right now by reputable individuals who are actually saying that the West has got this wrong. The Western media is not looking at this from the correct lens, especially Washington, especially the European capitals. I know the Independent newspaper has been slammed over the last few days over its coverage of these issues because they're saying that we're concentrating far too much on how Erdogan benefits out of this as opposed to who's actually responsible and the kind of trauma that Turkey's experienced. So let me just deal with that first before giving you my take on it. This is a very traumatic experience for any society. I guess any society that has to reel through the experience of a coup d'etat or a potential coup d'etat where civil administration is likely to be overthrown by a military junta, it's quite terrifying. If you're on the streets of a major city like Istanbul, where you've been, where I was born, to see tank shells being fired, gunships, firing rounds and attacking the parliament building, headquarters of the intelligence organization, I don't know if it's quite replicatable in terms of the trauma that it might sort of cause individuals. And Turkish society, I think, is right now very confused and very traumatized. I think the level of public debate right now that we see on Turkish media outlets is very, very inadequate to deal with what's going on. So that's just... in terms of who carried out this coup, I think we've heard one take of this by Professor Yayla here. I mean, I'm not sure the extent to which I agree with it, but let's see, I don't necessarily have any better information. I sort of propose a view that's sort of divergent to this, but then again, I don't have necessarily hard evidence to show you. This is more my view that's been informed by a collection of everything I've been trying to follow over the last 2 or 3 weeks. It does seem apparent that although the Turkish government would like to blame the Muslim recluse cleric who resides in Pennsylvania here, Mr. Fethullah Gülen, we have yet to see concrete evidence that draws a direct line between Gülen, as he sits in Pennsylvania, to the coup makers in Turkey who actually carried out this coup. I think that's yet to be established, and this is one of the things that the Turkish government will have to prove if Mr. Gülen is extradited to Turkey, as the Turks are adamant and very vociferously demanding of from US authorities. That being said, there seems to be an overwhelming amount of circumstantial evidence, personal testimonies, some which we understand are coming out under duress. Amnesty International is reporting a great amount of torture, a great amount of physical abuse of detained soldiers and would-be coup plotters who have been forced to sign testimonials and statements saying that they were involved, and yes, Mr. Gülen gave the order, but when you see a man whose head has been battered every which way but blue, it's hard to sort of verify the truthfulness of that statement. But that being said, there are more credible statements coming out from various other individuals. There are a couple of very trusted analysts that I follow who are suggesting that there have been significant elements of the Turkish military who are at least sympathetic to the Gülen movement and who have lain dormant within the military, within state institutions for a considerable length of time, who have now seized upon the opportunity to actually implement and try to unseat the democratically elected government of Turkey on the one hand, and presumably Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, on the other. Why now? One of the mainstream theories that is put forward, again, is the suggestion that at the end of this month, when the High Military Council, which is a supreme gathering of the promotion lists of the Turkish Chief of Staff, the military promotions, to basically fill in the biggest spots of the military's hierarchy, it was rumored that over 1,000 senior officers were going to be let go as part of Erdogan's ongoing de-Gulanification of Turkey, which had really gained pace since the Gezi protests of 2013. So in the ongoing struggle between Gulen and Erdogan, it seems that matters came to a head between Erdogan's forces and the Gulenist sympathizers within the military, as well as possibly other elements within the state and military who are not necessarily Gulenists. Was there a direct correlation? Did orders come through from the Gulen complex in America down to Turkey? We don't know that. But that might be something that we have to concentrate on and see how that unfolds in the future. Now, what is clear is what kind of impacts this is going to have on a whole variety of factors. The first, which is, I guess, what Washington and America, since we're here, is interested in, is how does this affect US-Turkish ties? I think it is likely to affect it very, very negatively. Right now, there is an immense amount of pressure that is brought to bear upon the Obama administration by the Turkish authorities. Erdogan's government, as well as the AKP government, is going hammer and tongs, saying, you have to hand over and extradite Gulen to Turkey now. Not tomorrow, not next month. We want him now. To this end, we have a delegation in Washington now from the Turkish government ministers saying, here we are, we want him, and we're going to present you with evidence, hopefully. On the American side, the Americans are saying, well, great, we'll consider it, but the extradition treaty that exists between the United States and Turkey, which was signed in 1979, there are 34 articles pertaining to this, anything from arson to rape to a whole series of offenses which are considered extraditable. Turkey's case has to merit and warrant the American standard of what would be beyond a reasonable doubt. And what the Turkish problem with that is right now, they don't have it. Nothing so far since the Turkish authorities have presented against Gulen for the last 3 years. This extradition, this handover request is not new. It goes back all the way since Gezi protests of 2013, although no formal extradition request has been made. But the demand by Turkish diplomats here in Washington has always been, hand him over, hand him over. And the American response has always been, what do you have that we can use in a court of law? Once that extradition request is made, that's going to be considered in the District Court of Pennsylvania, probably in Scranton, a low-level magistrate. If it gets approved by him or her, it goes up, then the Gulen's people can appeal that. It can go to federal court, after which it can go all the way to the Supreme Court if pushed. This is a time-consuming process, and the Turks are not right now in a position where they are willing to wait for this. So there's a whole series of things at risk. The future of Incirlik Air Base, which is the most effective territory where the fight against the Islamic State is prosecuted out of in terms of bombing sorties. And the Turks are even hinting at the fact that this might even be in jeopardy. And that obviously sends shivers down the spine of Washington. The second way that this really does impact US-Turkish relations, I guess, is the changing nature of the dynamic of the relation between Erdogan and Obama and the subsequent administration that comes into Washington, which is, do we have a NATO power that is based on reciprocal trust, the big picture, or is the Turkish side right now transitioning into a quid pro quo approach? Unless you hand over Gulen, all bets are off. And that I think is where the whole notion of this relationship is becoming very soured. And again, this is not something new. The relationship between Turkey and the United States has been in the offing and very much on the slide, as some of my colleagues can attest to, for the last 2 or 3 years, if not longer. But right now, it seems that the Erdogan government or the AKP government in Turkey is willing to even take this a step further, take it a notch up, and really say, if you don't necessarily do what we need you to do for us, we might not necessarily be the most cooperative ally in the future. And to that extent, even Erdogan has a meeting scheduled with the Russian president following the next Monday. So this does have very far ramifications outside the broad notion of where Turkey is headed as a democracy, as far as America is concerned. And this is, I guess, why the Turks find this so offensive. They're saying the Western media is concentrating on the wrong things. We're looking at this from the perspective of what you guys are interested in, Washington's interested in. You're not looking at it from the perspective of the trauma that's experienced, how a democracy that you're supposed to be an ally of is not being stuck up by you. And the American response, unfortunately, has really very much soured Erdogan's own predisposition to perceiving the United States as an ally. The chief of intelligence in this country, John Clapper, is on the record saying, we have no evidence to suggest that Gulen was involved. That right now, that doesn't play well with the Turkish government. The general in charge of Central Command has also said that, I can't remember what he said, I've got it down here somewhere. I'll visit that one in a second. But again, the message that is coming out of officials here is not what the government wants to hear. And the situation in Turkey has become so tense and so adamant and demanding that lack of action on the part of the US in the way that Turkey would like it to act is really straining relations. And something needs to happen where that is toned down on both sides. And this is something that's possibly awaiting the next administration, certainly in terms of fence mending, but in the immediate future, we do not necessarily should expect the handover or the extradition of Gulen. As I said, that's going to be very time-consuming. He may already have plans to go to another country where extradition between Turkey and the United States and that country has not been signed. Canada is one of these alternatives, possibly Mexico, although some other parts of sub-Saharan Africa where the Gulen movement is very strong. So to reiterate, we do not know if there is a direct correlation between the Gulen here, based in Pennsylvania, and a broader movement. It seems that a broad number of his sympathizers, for a very certain number of existential reasons, had a certain amount of circumstantial motive to instigate this. And that has been reciprocated in Turkey by a massive de-Gulenification on the one hand, where you see the purging, a wide net cast over tens of thousands of bureaucrats, military officials, as well as scholars in universities being detained, fired, put on administrative leave pending investigation. But you also see universities closed down, which are close to the Gulen movement, not just Gulen affiliated universities, but universities which is seen also to be very anti-Erdogan. So one of the speculations that's also coming out about this is this Erdogan's golden moment, to the extent that he said that this is a gift from God, of not just casting out the would-be coup makers, but also concentrating on, is this his golden opportunity to weed out and really hammer down as much political opposition that has been rising up in Turkey, certainly since the mid-2000s, well, specifically since the Gezi protests. I'm going to stop there and hopefully entertain more questions later on. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Professor Yona Alexander, for inviting me to this occasion and this panel. I'd like to stick to my 10 minutes because clearly the issue that we have at hand is a very controversial one. You have already heard two presentations. I'm not very sure what novelty I could bring to what you've heard so far. Professor Alexander made references to 1996, and he made this point. I'd like to make a reference to 70 years ago. 70 years ago, in 1946, the USS Missouri sailed into the Istanbul harbor. And since then, Turkey has been an ally of the West. It's been part of the Western transatlantic community. It has been a very uncomfortable relationship, controversial relationships with ups and downs. And the Turkish heart may have not always been in place with the transatlantic community. And clearly, in the course of the last couple of years, there has been a drift away from the shared values of the transatlantic community, and also quite a bit of shoving and hassling over common interest as well, as has been the case with respect to Syria. I'd like to argue that even if at this point in time we may not have the concrete evidence of who was behind the coup, that the coup is a traumatic experience. Allow me to equate it to 9/11. This is, in some ways, the 9/11 of Turkey. And do remember the remark that the president of the time, Junior George Bush, made on "you are either with us or not." This is the psychology in which the Turkish president is in, and the Turkish society is in as well. There is a lot that can be criticized about the Turkish president, and people do it, and Turkey is rediscovering that freedom of expression. I try to follow the debates that are taking place in Turkey right now, some of them 4 hours long each evening. And the kinds of people that were not allowed anywhere near the media in Turkey have now an opportunity to speak their mind and reflect on their experiences. And it's opening my eyes as an academic and as an expert, entre guillemets, of Turkey and maybe broader political issues. One point that has not come up so far is that the Turkish society, and quite a few, Sinan has made references to the kind of people that he's following in the Turkish media, people who share the very values to which the United States as a society and to which the European Union is committed to, have huge concerns about the way in which the Turkish state was penetrated by the Gülenist movement. Time will tell as to what the facts are. But when you listen to these debates, and when you listen to prosecutors, military and civilian prosecutors, who had in due course opened cases on this issue of infiltration, had actually faced indictments against themselves. And today, rightly or wrongly, they are attributing these indictments and the way in which they were not allowed to pursue their investigations to the fact that these were blocked by Gülenist prosecutors inside the judiciary, military officers inside the Turkish armed forces. Time will tell whether this is the case or not. I'm here to share this opinion that the Turkish public at large, including liberal people, including people who are attached to freedom of expression, to human rights, to the rule of law. And as I listen to these debates, and those of you who have some command of Turkish, I'm very willing to send the links to these debates, is also fascinating because these people, I can't assure you that they really mean it, But they do flag out the importance of rule of law and the importance of making sure that the innocent is not hurt, together with the culprits or the ones who have actually committed a crime there. Also, what they are underlining is the significance of making sure that people are appointed to their positions because of their merits, not because somehow they had access to questions in the exams they need to sit to qualify to enter military high schools, to enter the judiciary, to enter universities and elsewhere. I have been a university professor since 1983 and retired in 2013. So I have a few ideas, a few notions about exams and about exams that have been compromised and how that reflects itself in bureaucracies, including the police, the judiciary, as well as in the case of myself, first-hand experience, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. What these debates are also underlining is this interesting expression that some of the Turkish columnists have invented, going back to the factory settings of the Turkish Republic. And the factory settings of the Turkish Republic is referred to as secularism and democracy. I would be one of the first to argue that it's a bit ambitious to argue that democracy was a factory setting back in 1923. But do please put it in the context of Europe of the 1920s and 30s. I think democracy at the time simply meant, against the background in Europe of Ancien Regime, the idea that the people somehow would have a say. It took decades for Turkey to join the club of democracies, and it happened at the time when the Missouri sailed into the Istanbul harbor. And since then, Turkey has experienced a series of coups. I have lived through every single of them. 1960, I remember as a little boy, 6 years old, the recollection I have of it is a gendarme in the streets of Izmir. That's all I have. That's my notion of politics would have not gone beyond it. But I do see him there standing, a gendarme. And then came 1971. I was just at the verge of starting university, and I saw what happened. The consequences of 1971 was nasty. Young men of my age were executed, and then subsequently the Turkish society and state regretted it, just as Turkish society and state regretted that 3 ministers were hung in 1960. Then came 1980. Luckily, I was in London as a graduate student, and I heard it through the BBC World Service. Then came 1997, post-coup, they called it, or postmodern coup. I won't go into the details of it. And then 2007 came the so-called coup. So we are subjects or citizens of a country that has had these coups, but never was the parliament attacked. And I am still trembling that the Turkish parliament was attacked. It's a parliament that has been sitting there since April 1920. Whoever might be behind the coup, I think the West, the United States, and the European Union, I empathize greatly. I understand that they are angry towards the Turkish government and maybe towards the president for the kind of rhetorics and language he may be using. It's not helping the exercise of building bridges, finding the means for a dialogue. But the United States, I think the US is moving in that direction, and the European Union has to recognize that this is a trauma not that different than 9/11. And the Turkish people and Turkish students, some of them are here, are proud that the Turkish public went out into the streets and stopped this coup in its trails. They stood up in front of tanks. How did the West respond to what happened in 1989 in Beijing? Remember the guy standing up in front of the tank there? We all remember him. And the empathy and the sympathy that was expressed for this person. There are similar guys. They had to throw themselves under the tank, not to be crushed by it. Where is that empathy? Turkish opposition parties came together. The Republican People's Party, the Nationalist Party, the Kurdish Party, they all got together instantly. While I'm so disappointed I was here, that the US government did hesitate. The first line that came out from the Secretary of State, for which I have genuinely very high regard and respect, was a hesitant one, calling all parties to restraint. How can you call all parties to restraint when one is leading a coup against a legitimate government, problematic government in terms of democratic norms, etc.? You can't do it. And it was only after a bit later that from the White House an unequivocal statement making clear that Turkey was not going to be treated like Egypt came. Chapeau on that. How do the Turkish people feel about it? How do the Turkish people feel about this tweet that I'm going to read to you? Sorry, I've aged. I need reading glasses. I hope this is not true, but this is a tweet from New York Times World. It's a tweet with a link to a New York Times article with a different title. But the title here is, "The Erdogan supporters are sheep and they will follow whatever he says." This is not a statement you expect from a cradle of democracy. You may not like it. You may not like it, but this is a president who has received 52% of the public vote. Yes, there are question marks about how fair the election was, but it was free. And then the government he's presiding, there are question marks. Constitutional issues, whether he can preside or not, fair enough, these can be challenged. But the government right now is in power with 49% of the votes. This is not what they deserve, the people who voted for that particular political party. Neither did the others who voted for the other opposition parties have held. I don't want to go on, and I realize I had promised myself I was going to speak only for 10 minutes to be on the safe side. I realize this is a very controversial, difficult issue. But I would like to see the European Union and the United States to give Turkey the benefit of doubt. Like in 1946, the United States gesture at the time, sending the Missouri to the Istanbul harbor and the subsequent events, made out of Turkey a democracy, a problematic democracy. And then eventually that country evolved into a major economic powerhouse. Let's not remember, in spite of all the problems in the country, this is an economy that's still growing at 4.5%. Many in Europe are secretly wishing that they could do the same. How did Turkey come to here? And this is where I risk falling into serious trouble with general public opinion in Turkey. It's because Turkey was part of the Western alliance. Yes, right now there's huge and preposterous, what's the word? I can't pronounce it. Allegations against the United States and to a lesser extent to the European Union. But you have to understand the context. One of the commanders that have been stopped and arrested and that sought asylum with US authorities at Incirlik base. Turkish public are asking the question, how on earth a superpower like the United States would not know about what's going on? It's possible it would not know. There are a lot of things that the US has missed out on, including what happened in 9/11. But that's the psychology they are actually in right now. Today I listened, my final point, today I listened to a parliamentary group who have come clearly with the intention of trying to build little bridges, recognizing that they need dialogue and recognizing that, I think, I may be wrong, recognizing that they cannot afford to burn bridges with this Western alliance towards which there is this anger in the European Union. Yes, Erdogan will be meeting with Putin, but is really Russia an alternative for Turkey? Is Iran an alternative the way a 4-star general in 2002 had suggested? Turkey needs an economy, and I think those who are running Turkey right now recognize it even more in this particular context. So, to wrap up, it's a difficult situation. Time will make it much clearer, but give an ear to the Turkish public. Be them pro-AKP, supportive of Erdogan, be them the others. The only disappointing part of the delegation was that there was not a Kurdish MP included in it, and I wish it was there as well. However, I don't know what the background of the formation of that delegation was. I remain, frankly, hopeful. I cannot afford to say anything to the contrary, that Turkey will come out from the rut into which it has fallen. But I do really hope that it will come up with a helping hand from the European Union and from the United States. Imagine how the region would have looked like if that Missouri, USS Missouri, had not sailed into the Istanbul harbor and Turkey had not become part of that transatlantic community. The European Union would not need to worry about the European Union-Turkey migration deal, because I think the picture would have been a very, very different one, and the same thing applies for the fight against ISIS as well. I'm really sorry that I went on impromptu.
We have many questions for you later. Thank you very much.
That's a hard act to follow. I want to thank you for having me, Dr. Alexandra, Professor Alexander. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and especially with this distinguished panel. I think I'm going to probably take a different tone than our previous speaker. What I want to talk about today is the troubling trends that we've seen in Turkey over the last 3 to 4 years. And what I would argue today is that the events that we have seen after the coup, the failed coup, has accelerated those trends in my view. and I believe that's very worrying for the U.S.-Turkey relationship, and I'll explain. To understand, I think, where we are, I also think it's important to just backtrack and take a quick look at our recent past. I'll start in December of 2012 when reports began to emerge of a scheme that was uncovered where Turkey was working very closely with Iran it was called the Gas for Gold scheme, and this was a way for Iran to evade sanctions on a massive scale. Now, if you'll recall, it was during this time that the pressure was on Iran because of its nuclear program. Sanctions were at their peak, and it was a race against the clock. There was an attempt to squeeze Iran as much as possible from a financial perspective to bring it to the negotiating table and to prevent it from getting a nuclear weapon. As it turns out, Turkey was instrumental in helping Iran evade sanctions. It was to the tune of $10 to $15 billion. That was roughly half of Iran's cash reserves at the time. This, I think, gave Iran more time, gave it more leverage as it negotiated with the West, or as it was about to negotiate with the West. I'll get to it a little bit later, but we learned quite a bit about that scheme, this Gas for Gold scheme. There's an individual now who's about to stand trial here in the United States, and I'll explain how he fits in just a little bit later. But following Gas for Gold, and this was, of course, just to be very explicit here, there was the real concern that Turkey was working against the Western coalition at that time, working against Western interests. I mean, here you have a NATO country that is undermining the global effort to curtail Iran's nuclear program. Then fast forward to 2013, the following year, we began to see very troubling reports of Turkish meddling in Syria. Now, let me be very clear about Turkey's Syria policy. I agree with it very much in terms of its efforts to bring down the regime of Bashar al-Assad, and I think many here in this country would, and many around the world would as well. Of course, we're looking at something that's akin to genocide right now in Syria, and so it's very understandable that the Erdogan government would be opposed to Bashar al-Assad. But what we saw during that time, and what we've seen since, is a concerted effort on the part of the Turkish government to empower a broad range of actors that are involved in the Syria conflict, some of whom are very troubling. I can tell you that from a report that I wrote with a colleague who's here today, Merve, we talked to former government officials who were talking to the Turks about their border policy, how they had allowed for jihadi fighters to cross from Turkey's southeastern frontier into ISIS or Nusra-controlled territory. And what we heard from these officials was that this was essentially a Turkish strategy to try to bring down the Assad regime without having to get involved personally. So it was a proxy war. And they were not really distinguishing between the so-called moderate rebels and the more extremists, the jihadi variety. And so what we saw was a very troubling trend of traffic. We saw weapons going in, bulk cash going into these territories. Obviously, a stream of fighters who were coming in, most of them flying to Istanbul, making their way east and crossing over the border for a nominal fee of $25 or more. We saw an oil pipeline that was coming out of Syria into Turkish territory, and this has been documented by many journalists at this point. I think probably the best report is the one done by Mike Giglio of BuzzFeed, if anyone has seen that. But it was very clear that that jihadi groups were able to sell their oil onto the black market through Turkish middlemen, and of course the Turks were again turning a blind eye to this activity. We also saw the sale of antiquities, and this has, I think, received a lot of attention in recent years. So what we saw was that the southeastern Turkey had become a zone of illicit finance, a zone of support for a range of jihadi actors. There was a lot of concern that was voiced quietly by U.S. government officials. These discussions were rarely voiced beyond a whisper, although we did catch glimpses of it from Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, from Vice President Joe Biden, and a few others, and we saw many, many visits by Treasury officials who were concerned about these illicit finance issues, and those things were raised. I think, just perhaps a side note, this was a failed strategy on the part of Turkey. I think we've seen blowback inside Turkish territory. We had been noting for the last couple of years that there was the potential for cells to be growing inside Turkey. In other words, this was not just a southeastern Turkey phenomenon, but rather we were beginning to see that there were recruitment cells and supporters of ISIS and Nusra and other jihadi groups that were based in places like Ankara and Istanbul. And so we became increasingly alarmed about that activity. Then in September 2013, there was another news story that further indicated strained ties between Turkey and the United States, and this was a contract that was signed with a Chinese company. This was called the Chinese Precision Machinery Export-Import Corporation. This won a contract to sell a sophisticated weaponry to the Turks outside of the sort of NATO umbrella. And NATO allies were beginning to voice serious concern about this sale because of the potential for integration of this Chinese system into a NATO system and what this might mean for cyber attacks or gaining information about NATO weaponry. Then in December of 2013, we saw the leak of the Istanbul prosecutor's report. This was for FTD, where we focus a great deal on illicit finance. This was a real eye-opener. This, of course, has been attributed to the Gulen movement, and I have no reason to doubt that it was the Gulen movement that leaked this report. It was mind-boggling, the amount of illicit financial activity that was detailed in there. That we saw banks facilitating illegal transactions. We saw classic money laundering techniques like over-invoicing, where brown sugar was sold for $430 a pound. Amazing ways of bringing money through Turkey and on to places like Iran. Total amount of illicit financial activity estimated to be roughly $100 billion. Really an astounding report, never quite confirmed as official, but it did elicit a massive crackdown. And this was what we began to see inside Turkey, was the crackdown on the Gulenist movement, really in response to many of these leaks. What was troubling to me also was that we were not seeing the Turkish parliament or the judiciary being able to take action, or at least even be able to investigate further, because this is really when the purges began at a perhaps a slower pace. In 2014, we noted at FTD that the Financial Action Task Force, which is essentially the UN of terrorism finance, had finally delisted Turkey as a gray-listed country, a country that was not up to standards in terms of its terror finance regime. And what was amazing about that is that Turkey was on the gray list for 7 years, that it was simply not implementing the recommended standards for terrorism finance. And then, of course, later on that year, there was the Hamas war with Israel, and we noted with alarm that the person who sparked that war was a man named Saleh Arouri. Mr. Arouri was the West Bank chief of the Izzadin al-Qassam brigades. This is the armed wing of Hamas. It was Mr. Arouri who planned and facilitated and financed the kidnapping and killing of 3 teens in the West Bank, and that attack sparked the 2014 war. I can tell you that today, even with the recent rapprochement between Israel and Turkey, that there are still roughly a dozen Hamas activists and figures still based in Turkey today. And all the while, we had Turkey fighting against the United States in terms of its involvement in the counter-ISIL campaign. That it was actually only until this time, roughly last year, that Turkey joined actively the fight against ISIS, despite the fact that this was a NATO country bordering on Syria. We now see Turkey still involved, but not certainly to the extent that I think the West would like to see it. And so this has given one a sense that Turkey's foreign policy has not been aligned with the United States for quite some time, and certainly not aligned with that of NATO. And all the while, we did see crackdowns on the press. Turkey's become a leading jailer of journalists. The judiciary, as I mentioned, has not thrived. And as we've already heard, the current president, Tayyip Erdogan, has tried to change the system, and I think he's well on his way from changing it from a parliamentary system to that of a presidential system, and so he's consolidating power. And this has also been a concern. We know from State Department and other officials that this has been an ongoing topic of conversation. And so this brings us to the July 15th coup. The crackdown continues today. The consolidation continues. We're seeing signals of a potential withdrawal from the counter-ISIL coalition. And there is concern, as we've heard today, of a withdrawal from the U.S. partnership, or at least a downgrading of it. Let me be very clear. I think the U.S.-Turkish relationship is crucial from a geographic perspective, from a political perspective, from a bridge between the United States and the West to the Middle East. There's been a lot of talk about whether Turkey might be removed from NATO or might remove itself from NATO. I can only tell you this, that it will be complicated. And I think that's an understatement. As we've studied NATO, it's very difficult. It's not easy to join NATO, but it's also extremely difficult to be removed from it. I would actually go as far as to say it sort of reminds me of the Hotel California. You can try to check out, but there's no way you're leaving, at least the way that things are currently constructed, and I can't imagine that Turkey would want to do that. But I can see a potential downgrading of ties and a steady downgrading of ties. And as we've heard, a possible warming of ties with countries like Russia and Iran. The concern now is I think, primarily for Incirlik Air Base. This is home to 1,500 American servicemen. It is home to a squadron of A-10s. It is home to a number of armed drones that have been active inside Syria. And we have other military assets elsewhere, including radar, search and rescue teams, which are crucial given how close they are to the Syrian border to be able to to extract special operators both from the U.S. and from other countries that may be operating inside Syria. And of course, it's been widely reported that the United States or Western countries have nuclear weapons in Turkey. And to think that all of this right now is going on, this great strain, while these assets are there, is deeply troubling. So I think right now, it's going to be important for the United States to consider contingency plans for all of these military assets and for the 3,000 or so total servicemen that are based in Turkey. There is great concern that as the CIA, Barack Obama, Gulen, whoever, that the United States is somehow behind this coup. It certainly seems as if the servicemen who are there are subject to perhaps some danger. We've seen the protests and we've seen the calls, the anti-Americanism that's been spiking. And so the key right now from our perspective, from my perspective, is to try to bring Turkey back into the fold. How to do this when they blame us for the coup is extremely difficult for me to see. I think the rhetoric obviously needs to be tamped down. And the Gulen issue is going to be a thorny one. The extradition of this man, certainly we will see that his followers were likely involved in this coup on some level, but to be able to prove that an old man who's been living as a recluse in the Poconos, that we could directly tie him to this plot, I think strikes me as extremely difficult. The other thing that I'll mention, I mentioned the gold trader early on. This trial of Reza Zarrab, which is coming up in the early fall, I think has also the potential to greatly strain U.S.-Turkish relations. The trial itself is going to be about sanctions busting. It's going to be about how one individual with strong ties to both the Turkish government and the Iranian government was able to move so much gold and so much money in and out of Turkey. But as we now understand, the story of Reza Zarrab very much involves the upper echelons of the Turkish government, in fact, the Erdogan family. And if that information begins to come out in court, it will be extremely volatile, especially in this environment. And so this is going to be something that I would say could make or break Turkish-U.S. relations, or at least tip the scales in one way or the other. I'll conclude with this, that at the core here is not about whether the United States was harboring Gulen. Of course, we have been, and I think without much argument from Erdogan or the AKP for many, many years up until 2013. I think really the core here is that we are looking at a leader of Turkey who has been on a slide toward autocracy, towards Islamism. This has been a steady trend. And so there's no doubt in my mind that the coup that was attempted on July 15th was anti-democratic. It was an assault on liberalism. It was an assault on NATO. It was an assault on Western values. But I can also say very clearly that what we have seen from this AKP government over the last 3 or 4 years has also been an assault on Western values. It has also been an assault on NATO. And so it is now up to all of us to try to bring these elements all together under one roof, US and Turkish, and try to work out a way forward. And for right now, it seems like a very difficult one at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and the other panelists for very valuable insights. I would like to develop the discussion with the audience, but let me ask one question, the panelists. I think Jonathan mentioned specifically NATO and the challenge there. What is really important, I think, also to consider is not just what's happening today in Turkey or yesterday, but to try to assess the value, the added value of Turkey as a partner for many decades, going all the way back to the Korean War, and Turkey's contribution to NATO over the years as a reliable partner, because it's much broader than Turkey itself, the future of NATO, European security, particularly against the backdrop of the refugee crisis. My question relates now to the broader, I think, scenario of the global dimension. And the Secretary General of the United Nations made a statement that actually expressed some grave concern related to the future role of NATO as a reliable partner. And since the Secretary General of the United Nations doesn't speak for one country but the entire membership, I wonder, does the Secretary General actually reflected the views of many dozens of countries, for example, in the so-called Arab world, or whatever it is, or the Muslim world, or the non-Muslim world. So the question to the panelists is, can the United Nations become a tool to provide clarity to the confusion of the role of the international community to deal with security concerns, because otherwise it bodes, I think, quite negatively on the future of the United Nations itself.
I think United Nations. Okay, can you hear me? I think United Nations approach is critical from several points of view, but as you mentioned, that the General Secretary is representing all of the countries. He cannot, I guess, openly speak about what's going on in terms of the issues in the region, especially the human rights violations and the freedom of express problems in Turkey, which reflects the problems to the whole region in terms of fighting against terrorism in the region, against ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, or other jihadis who are carrying out their terrorism to the West, now especially to Europe, which is a big concern, because Turkey acts as a gatekeeper to those terrorist organizations, and it is essential that we stop them at the border between Syria and Turkey. Unfortunately, now we cannot do that So I think, I trust and believe that those issues needs to be addressed by the UN.
Any?
I'll take a pass.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll take your pass.
Okay.
I have great respect for the United Nations. However, there is a general recognition that the United Nations effectiveness on political and security issues, not on humanitarian issues, on developmental issues, on economic issues, is being questioned. And clearly, from my point of view, a world without United Nations would certainly not be any better off.
You want? Okay. Now we'll open it up. Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Don't sit me on me.
Once again, Yona has created an extraordinary panel. Two aspects. One is the external. Jonas just touched on it again, NATO, the UN, et cetera. The other is the internal. And we're talking about democracy. That's an internal thing. And I'd like to ask a question, particularly of the Turks on the panel. I lived in Turkey many years ago. I have many Turkish friends of all political stripes. One of the things that an American sees, I don't know about Turks, but an American sees is the following. You have sort of the Ataturk created elites, if you will, rather secular. One of you equated with being liberal. They're secular. They're also quite nationalistic in many cases. Then you have what was really unknown to Americans in the past and not focused on, and maybe unknown to the Turkish elites. A large part of the Turkish population is religious. They're Muslims. I think Turkey may be the most Muslim country in the world. I think it's about 99.9% Muslim. It's quite an extraordinary figure. It doesn't say anything one way or the other. My own feeling is that within the religious part of Turkey, which is the majority, there are, of course, divisions. Some of you have mentioned Gülenists. There are others. So let's call them today Gülenists versus Erdoganists. But then you have the secular. Now, these are three large elements. And I haven't mentioned the Kurds or anything like that. It strikes me that the balance, how shall I put it? The relationship between these elements is crucial to the future of Turkish democracy. And I haven't heard one of you mention it, really. And I think it would be very useful to add that into the mix along with all of the anguish that America is feeling about what it should be thinking about Turkey right now. I think much more important is what a Turk's thinking about Turkey, although from an American point of view, it's also important what do we think about Turkey. Thanks.
Okay. Any comments or questions from the audience? Would you identify yourself for the record and ask a question? Here is the mic. Can you show him what to do?
Yeah, thank you very much. Dikkat at Georgetown University, and first, I want to thank all the speakers here because I think what we got from this meeting so far is what's really at stake. And just to follow up on Professor Wallace, what's at stake, you're absolutely right, is first Turkish democracy. What's going to happen to the country? And I'm a little bit concerned because with all the blame put on Gülen and his role and the Gülenists, it concerns me, and I'm concerned about it because, you know, Gülen is basically a pro-Western, pro-democracy, pro-human rights movement. I don't see any danger for democracy precisely coming from that movement. If, you know, you have another impression, then I would like to hear about it. But what I know about the Gülen movement is that it is pro-Western, that it is democratic, and I'm more concerned, I have to say, about the other side. So now let's look into this again. The nature of the coup, and Professor Rishi, you know, told us how anti-democratic it was. And I think we need to know more about it. The forces, so-called anti-democratic forces behind it. Who are they? Do we know enough in order to say that it is an anti-democratic coup, or was it one that tried to implement a stronger democracy in Turkey? I mean, that's an open question to me. I just say how important the stakes are. And the second big, great stake is Turkey's relationship with the West. And we heard about anti-Americanism in Turkey and how much the coup is now blamed on the United States. And not only on the Gülen movement, the United States is behind it, CIA is behind it, and the old story. So feeding into this very dangerous picture of anti-Americanism, and you know, some of you who know Ivan Krastev, who talked about the anti-American 21st century. Now, that remark is important because it doesn't criticize the United States. It criticizes the forces behind this anti-Americanism, which are anti-democrats, anti-pluralistic forces, and that's what we need to look at. Last point that I want to come back to what Professor Ayer said at the beginning. He made a point that I didn't quite understand, and that is, we talked about the coming Salafist revolution.
Yes.
Help us to understand who that is. Who are the forces behind that coming revolution, which would be a most dangerous one if I, perceive the situation correctly. So, are the coup makers, the forces behind the coup, that Salafist movement? I doubt it very
No.
much. So this is, are those who try to fight it now? Is that on Erdogan's side? Maybe. So, let's have a discussion about
Sure.
that. And I think these are very essential issues. And again, I thank you all, for giving us a better sense of what's really at stake and how important it is what we have seen in Turkey. Thank you.
Okay. How I read and analyze this in terms of where we are going from here, I guess you caught a few critical points and excellent question, my friend. Why Salafism behind it, and why I have doubts about this coup? First of all, the first blame goes to Gülen. And from an investigative point of view, and as far as I know, for 20 years I worked with the military, our military is ultra-secularist.
Ultra
And
what?
Ultra-secularist.
Secularist.
Yes. I know generals, soldiers, not allowing praying. Even now, or just 2-3 years ago, it was almost impossible to pray openly between the soldiers or inside the military compounds. I remember when I was a young sergeant, going after businessmen to see, by the request of the military, if they were praying 5 times a day, because it was deemed as a crime. So fast forward to today, the majors, lieutenants that I worked at the time are the generals today. And I have very much doubt that they were Gülenists. As far as I have connections or interactions with them, last time in Şanlıurfa, none of them were Gülenists. They were ultra-secularists, most of them, mainly. And also, I also have this question. If Gülen was so powerful inside the military, why was he watching for the last 3 years all his institutions being crashed, not only in Turkey, but they were trying to do it overseas, internationally, and did not force Erdogan to a negotiating table with the generals he had inside the military, basically threatening him with that force he has in the military for a coup. So I don't buy the fact that Gülen is completely behind that coup, but what could happen, as far as I can read, there is a strong sentiment against Erdogan and what he was doing in the military, that's for sure. And I think everybody from different parts of ideologies came together against this coup, against Erdogan, but they couldn't carry out the coup because he was aware of it, and somehow some generals carried out a counter coup, which was maybe a stage coup, I don't know. But how I can see that, I still can see the chief of staff, top generals in charge today, even though several hundreds generals are fired, by the way, which are the elite forces of counter-terrorism generals, and who worked really closely with NATO. And I know that there are reports, the rest of the generals who are in charge right now are, some of them at least, pro-Russian, who openly claimed that we should leave NATO and we should join Shanghai Five. So these are the big questions that we need to answer. When it comes to Salafism, I unfortunately see very openly and clearly for the last 5 years, Turkish rhetoric coming from the Diyanet, the religious authority of Turkey, from the government, that we see is against our moderate Sunni Islam, maybe Sufi Islam that we can name. And it is very dangerously close to Salafi ideology, which is behind Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And I have witnessed this with my own eyes in the government when I was interacting with the Salafi terrorists, ISIS and Al-Qaeda members. So I see this very dangerous. Under normal circumstances in the past, Turkish public was very close to Salafism and Al-Qaeda-like terrorist organizations, but now it is in our books in the schools. It is being taught openly, and some parts of the government openly supporting those terrorist organizations and their ideologies. Even the Tekfiri ideology, which has never been in Turkey. This is what can I say? I can say.
I mean, I'll be brief as possible, but it's hard to be brief about this. Here's what I think. I think the problem that Turkey's very much facing, some of the questions that you've entertained, the question, Camille, I could not disagree with you wholeheartedly more. I think the part of the problem is both the Gulen movement and the Erdogan movement have been complicit in trying to transform Turkey into their own private playground. And it's amazing the extent to which how they've accomplished this. I cannot place the Gulen movement in any sort of sphere of democratization. I mean, you can take it back as far as you can. I'll start off with 2007. I mean, you know, the decamalization of Turkey was something that the Gulen movement was very complicit in. The trials and the Google trials and the horrific treatment of professors, military officers, Turkan Saylan, one of the most progressive education people, just because she was being in competition with the Gulen movement over the cause of education in Turkey, resulted in a woman dying of cancer, being indicted and almost imprisoned, had she not died. The Gulen movement is, on the one hand, has been trying to topple Erdogan for a variety of reasons, simply because their interests do not coincide anymore. It's been a lover's quarrel, a mutual attempt at trying to sort of tolerate one another as far as they could go. This was never a project about democratization on part of the Gulen movement. It was about seizure of state entities. As far as Erdogan's movement, again, I mean, you know, I have never been a supporter of the Erdogan cause, not for once in my life. The National View movement of Turkey, the political Islamist movement of Turkey, has had a quarrel with the very tenets of what Turkey and where Turkey emanates from since its establishment. And it's only since 2010, since Erdogan's been on a sort of quest to eliminate political opposition, he looks at politics and the country as a board game of risk. I mean, you know, let's fire 20,000 people here. Let's take, you know, appoint judges to this, and now let's get rid of generals. It's just, it seems on some level it's some sort of existential game. The larger picture is not one whereby Turkey is being led by institutions. It's being dominated by personalities. Yes, he's a 77-year-old man in Pennsylvania, but I, for one, cannot condone or fathom that anything of July 15th happened without the complicit knowledge of Fethullah Gulen in Pennsylvania. I cannot agree with that. I don't have evidence, but it seems to be highly circumspect for a movement which is in the last 40 years of its budding, has had so many directives, so do this, do that, take down this, put this person in jail, try military officers, take over the education sector in Turkey, appoint professors to this university. I mean, it's just a playground of two dominant personalities, and it's just such a shame. Sorry, that was quite emphatic.
Having just listened to Sinan, it makes me think of those two American elephants that we talk a lot about. When they fight, it's the grass that suffers. And the grass here, I'm afraid, not taller than this, is Turkish democracy. And that's what's happened in the last 5 to 8 years. It's a challenge. It really is a challenge to mold Islam and democracy. I have to say, chapeau to the AKP governments of 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Then I think problems begin. But I also cannot help but think if Turkey would be somewhere completely different today, in the positive sense of the word, if Angela Merkel, for whom I have also great respect, and Nicolas Sarkozy, for whom I have question marks, had not adopted the language they did towards Turkey. Quite demeaning language. I was involved in it. Turkey made a genuine effort to make the criteria for UN membership.
EU membership.
You got me confused with you.
Right.
EU membership. It was not easy. There was a lot of resistance and half-heartedness and all this, but it made an effort, and society was mobilized in support of it. And the Annan plan, we must not forget it. Erdogan staked his political career and prestige behind it. What happened?
The Greeks.
Those who rejected the Annan plan became members of the European Union and bent backwards to stick the spanner in the wheels.
Cyprus.
What was the EU capable of doing? Promising that those who had voted in favor of the Annan plan would benefit from the lifting of trade sanctions and restrictions on the freedom of movement. And all glorious European Union, not the United Nations, did not deliver on those promises. Think about Erdogan's position vis-à-vis those who were arguing that the EU would not deliver on its promises. So there's that side to it. It's a very complicated picture. And yes, today, in today's Turkey, especially liberals, secularists are worried about the future, about the space, public space for themselves. However, I still want to be optimistic. And these two elephants fighting with each other has created, I think, wisdom and reason that the very good question you asked, Dietrich, about all these different groupings, that somehow an equilibrium needs to be found. And that the policies that AKP followed in the past couple of years that polarized the country more and more needs to be bridged. And I see the way in which opposition parties reacted and the way in which the media, especially the media that suffered in the hands of the government, responded, opens up an opportunity for reconciliation. It's up to Turks to deal with this, and Kurds as well. But the EU and the United States, I am arguing, and I'm sorry I was distracted. I have a piece, hopefully will be posted precisely on this issue, has to adopt policies that can enlarge the space rather than suffocate it. And so far, I think what has been said, from my judgment, is not helping to enlarge the space. And that's why I underline the need of empathy. But Dietrich, I agree, there is huge challenges. But I must also underline that the world is facing challenges. Look at what's happening in Brazil. Look at what's happening in this country. In this country, you have watched the Han couple and the reaction that they have had. Chapeau to the American society chapeau to those who have stood up. And it is those who have stood up for that couple that will hopefully maintain the US as a lighthouse towards which other democracies will be able to move. But if it doesn't happen, think the consequences on Turkey. Look at the European Union.
Brexit.
Islamophobia is, it's I can't find the expression. but
Rampant is the
it's
word
out
you're
of its cage. Out of its cage. And I belong to a generation that saw the Europe, or rather the consequences of a Europe whose phobia had been unleashed from the cages in the 1930s. So Europe has a record, has a past record. And hence the US is critical in this. Hence it's critical that democratic forces in Europe try to see something positive that's happening in Turkey and give it the benefit of doubt.
I'm going to just very briefly try to respond to your question. I think it's an important one. Look, when one tries to understand what brand of Islamism Erdogan embraces, I think it's elusive. I think there was a brand of Islamism that we talked about during the Arab Spring, where Erdogan was anointed as this model for Islamic democracy, and that Turkey was slated to be the model for all of these other fledgling democracies that were erupting around the Arab world. That collapsed. And I think that since that time, that failed bet that Turkey had placed, I think we've seen a very troubling trend, and I mentioned some of it during my prepared remarks, but just looking at those who are welcomed inside Turkey right now, we see members of the Egyptian Salafi community. We see Libyan Salafis and jihadis. As I mentioned, we've seen members from the Nusra Front and other jihadi groups that are welcome to travel back and forth across that border. And of course, we've seen Hamas and others. It's still unclear to all of us whether this is the Islam that Erdogan embraces, that he envisions this to be the Islam of the country of Turkey. I think it's untenable, but he has still welcomed it, and I think it's upon us and upon him to try to figure out exactly what that means. Right now, we're still to be told that this is Islamist light, and that there is a balance between those who are secular and those who are more religious in the country. But this is exactly what has triggered, from what we understand, the alarm of the Gulenist community. That they have, as you mentioned, are committed to a more sort of quietist version of Islamism, and find that this more radical brand of Islamism is incompatible with that of Turkey. The problem with Gulen, and you mentioned that maybe he's the model, the problem is that in his opposition to Erdogan's brand of Islamism, to his adventurous foreign policies, we have seen a movement that has resorted to things that we can't possibly imagine here in this country, where you're seeing phone conversations being tapped apparently through intelligence channels, and then being released to the public. Classified documents like the Istanbul prosecutor's report being leaked before their time. These are what we would call dirty tricks. And so what this is I mean, you call it two elephants. I mean, these are two people who are purportedly fighting for democracy in their own country, and in the process strangling it, whether they know it or not. Both of them.
Okay, we have time for one or two other. Can we have the mic right here, please?
I'm Shukumi from Turkish Embassy here in Washington, D.C. I want to thank everyone who joined this panel. And I want to say some I want to talk about facts, but before that, I want to touch upon the things that has been mentioned by some panelists about Turkey, ISIS, and Salafism issue. I don't want to say anything in detail about these speculations, but relating Turkey and Turkish government to ISIS, I think it's some kind of, I want to pick my words, but it's a bit absurd because Turkey is one of the countries suffered most from ISIS and this ideology, and relating this country to this ideology, at least disrespecting the South that we lost in the last couple of months. And about the facts, one of the panelists asked why the coup started at 10 p.m., not 3 a.m. Actually, it was planned for 3 a.m. in the morning. We see that from the testimonies of the officers, and we see that from the so-called declaration of the coup. It was thought to be initiated at 3 a.m. in the morning, but since a major from the military informed the intelligence agency in Turkey, they had to start the coup earlier than it was planned. Why coup plotters didn't cut the communication system? Actually, they tried to do so. They tried to capture the Turksat base, which is the base that controls the entire communication in Turkey, but they failed. And when they failed, they decided to bomb the base. And
No, they failed because they didn't know there was a backup system
Yeah.
that had only been put into place 2 weeks earlier. Pure
About-
chance.
Yeah. About the purges, I mean, it's not started, I mean, these names has not been decided just after the coup attempt. Actually, there was an ongoing investigation in Turkey since 2013 after the first civilian coup attempt by the Gülenist movement. And since this Fethullah Gülen terrorist organization is declared as a terrorist organization by the National Security Council of Turkey, as I said, there was an ongoing investigation, and coup attempt just made it a bit earlier and faster than it was planned. So it wasn't, the names didn't come up just after the coup attempt, so it was a part of an ongoing investigation anyway. Regarding the anti-Americanism in Turkey, I think our Minister of Foreign Affairs made it very clear in his statement that we are very concerned about the ongoing increasing anti-Americanism in Turkey, and we think that the United States is not behind the coup at all, but the people on the street, it's very easy for the people on the street to make some connections when they read newspapers here and when they see some statements from state officials implicating that the one that you mentioned that about, just after the coup, and there are some representatives of the House tweeted about the coup, calling for it to be more successful so that Turkey could be more democratic or so on. So regular people on the street can make this connection very easy, but as Turkish officials and ministers, they stated several times that this is not true, and Turkish-US relations are very important to us, and we are passing through a test, that's for sure, but we have to be conscious about what we say and what we do in these very difficult times. And regarding the counter-ISIL operations, from the first moment till now, on the highest level, President, Prime Minister, and Minister of Foreign Affairs reassured several times that Turkey will be participating in the coalition, and Incirlik base opened just after a couple of days. It was closed because of this extraordinary times, and the Turkish fly zone was closed for a couple of days, but now it's fully operational, and also the operations started from Gaziantep and other cities of Turkey as well. So questioning Turkey's role in NATO and other in Western coalition is somehow far-fetched ideas from my point of view, and I can say that Turkey has been a very important part of this Western alliance for the last 60 years, and it will be so. And hopefully, our Western friends will stand with us against this coup attempt like the Turkish people did on 15th of July.
Before the panelists respond, I have one more.
defer to General Gray.
Okay, General Gray, this is your turn.
This is taps.
As usual, Dr. Alexander asked me to wrap things up 10 minutes after we're finished. So I want to thank our distinguished panel for I think, a superb outline of the challenges we face and certainly some good suggestions on what to do about it. I couldn't help but think that, it took us about 200 years of colonial and pre-colonial experience before we became a republic and ultimately a democracy. And it takes a long time to really get to that point. 216 years ago, I guess, is when Turkey as a nation started that climb. At the end of the Ottoman Empire and the like, and when you had the big movements of what they call social reform or Tazimat, and with initially Mahmud and later Abdullah II, and all that for 100 years. They studied these challenges and they tried to bring about these reforms. And little by little, they did it. Some quicker than other times and so on, some not as good and the like, but they made it. And you go on through history and into the 1900s, and of course, with the Young Turk movement and the like, and all that they brought about to this great nation of Turkey. And I happen to be a big fan of Turkey for a lot of reasons, and I'll get to that for a minute. But they brought that on, and then of course with the time of Ataturk and their own revolution, if you will, or their own battle for 6 or 7 years for independence and like, and then finally what emerged is the modern Turkey and a nation that we can, I think we should all be very, very proud of. Make no mistake, NATO, Turkey as a nation, and and from the standpoint of geography alone, is vital to the future of the NATO and the organization and peace in Europe and elsewhere around the world as we know it today. And so, what should we do? I was thinking, well, what would I do? Well, I don't know what I would do. First of all, I'd get some leaders in America and in the international community, and I'd go back and I'd look at the history of Turkey so I knew what the hell I was talking about, and understood where they were and where they've been and where they have come to today. I would also, I think, look around not only in America but in the international community for some people who have credibility. There are people, some are columnists and the like, some are academic personnel, some are military and the like, but there are people who are trusted in Turkey and vice versa. And these people should be brought into the conversation. We've got to this idea of how did the coup start, and I don't think you'll get to the bottom of it precisely today because of the social media and all the other things. Anybody can say whatever they want, and whether it's true or not. And so it's going to be very difficult to ascertain just exactly what happened. And I'm not sure that's the real challenge. I think the real challenge is to go forward now and repair what has to be fixed and like, and go forward in terms of not only NATO, but in terms of the European community and all of that. I would hope that someone that the leader of Turkey respects would be able to communicate with him and say, you gotta watch what you're doing here now. You shouldn't be resting, in my judgment, all these academic people and all these media people and everything. I mean, they're arresting or holding down a great many men and women in Turkey today, and that's, in my humble opinion, that's going to hurt him in the long run if he's not careful. So these are the kind of things that I think people ought to consider. But make no bones about it, NATO, Turkey has been and will be a strong ally of what we stand for in our great country. I have personal direct knowledge of their bravery, of how they fought in Korea and the like, in the outpost wars near the end of the Korean War and the like, what they did and the sacrifice they made. And I've also had the privilege of visiting Ataturk's tomb and the like in Ankara, and I know the traditions of Turkey. I know what they're made of, and I like them personally because they all have tough hands. I like fellow fighters and fellow infantrymen who have tough hands, not these oily-looking hands with bullet watches on them, but tough hands. These are the kind of friends that you want to have when you go to battle. With that, thank you again for what I think was a great seminar.
Thank you.